A lot of you are here because Cyclops just dropped in Marvel Rivals, and what I want to show you is that everything you think you know about this guy being boring is a lie. Marvel told you over and over for 60 years. It starts right here. Scott Summers is 9 years old, strapped to a single parachute with his little brother, falling out of a burning plane over Alaska. Their mother had shoved both boys out of the only chute they had before the plane went down, and on the way to the ground, the parachute catches fire. Scott hits the dirt head first and doesn't wake up for a year. When he finally comes out of that coma, the part of his brain that would have let him control his mutation has been permanently damaged. His eyes fire whenever they're open. They always will. There's no off switch, and there never will be. The boring one, the rule guy, the one standing between Wolverine and something interesting. That's the version you got. And over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to show you that the people responsible for that version weren't other characters. They were the people getting paid to tell his story. Now, let me back up a little bit because I think the power thing matters more than people realize, and I want you to have it clearly before anything else. His eyes don't shoot lasers. That's a movie shorthand, and even some of the comics get it wrong. What comes out of Scott Summers' eyes when he opens them is pure concussive force. Kinetic energy, no heat, no light, just the equivalent of getting hit by something very large and very fast. And the reason he can't control it isn't willpower. The brain injury from the crash broke the regulatory system before his mutation ever fully developed. So the only thing standing between him and destroying whatever he's looking at is a piece of ruby quartz. Forever. Forever. Now think about what that actually means as a person. Every relationship you will ever have happens through a filter. You'll never just look at someone you love. Every face you've memorized exists on the other side of glass. That's not a metaphor. That's Tuesday for Scott Summers. He's going up on a Tuesday. And the part that makes it so much worse, the orphanage he woke up in, it was secretly run by one of the X-Men's most disturbing villains, a geneticist called Mr. Sinister, who'd been obsessed with Scott's bloodline for over a century. Depending on which era you read, Sinister either deepened the damage or put his own mental blocks on Scott's powers to control him, and buried the memories so deep that even Scott didn't know about it. So even the one place that was supposed to be safe for him as a kid was a lie. Whether you go with the brain injury or Sinister's tampering, the through line is identical. Scott Summers never had a single fair shot at controlling who he was. Somebody else always had their hand on the dial. Charles Xavier found him eventually and made him the first X-Man. And I know that sounds like a rescue, but here's what I think is actually happening here. Xavier didn't save Scott. He found a traumatized kid with a power he couldn't control and gave him a mission, leadership, responsibility, the dream. And Scott, being who he is, took all of that and held it together because that's what he does. He holds things together. He was doing it on the way down from that plane. So the discipline that made fans write him off, the by-the-book field commander, the guy who seems stiff while Wolverine's being cool, that was never a personality flaw. He learned as a child exactly what comes apart when he doesn't hold it. And he has been holding it ever since. Here's the thing that keeps getting me about Scott. Pause, edit this part. Now, if you've been watching my channel, you know I just went into depth on Ben Reilly, Spider-Man's clone, the character assassination, all of it. And I keep recognizing the same pattern in Scott's history. A publisher takes a character people actually connected with, hands him a decision he didn't make, then watches the audience turn on him and frames it for him eventually. Ben Reilly, Scott Summers, these are the poster boys for that specific move. And I think the reason I've always been drawn to Scott is that the character underneath all the interference is genuinely, deeply cool. And it bothers me that so many people never got to meet that version of him. So why exactly did people turn on him? Honestly, some of it the writing earned. For most of the late 70s and 80s, he was written as relentlessly correct and not much else. Wolverine showed up in 1975 and immediately had more dimension. Morally complicated, genuinely dangerous, the guy your responsible older brother wouldn't want you emulating. Scott was that responsible older brother. The writing made him a function of the team more than a person on it. And that's a real problem, even if it's a writing problem and not a Scott problem. But the thing he never recovered from, the moment fans actually point to when they call him irredeemable, that one wasn't earned at all. And I want to tell you this one carefully because I think it matters more than anything else in this video. By the mid-1980s, the writer who'd been building the X-Men for over a decade, a guy named Chris Claremont, had given Scott a life outside the team. A wife named Madelyne Pryor, a baby son named Nathan. Scott had retired. He was out. He had the thing every superhero supposedly fights for, an actual future. Then in 1986, Marvel decided to launch a new comic reuniting the original 5 X-Men, which required Jean Grey, Scott's first love, to come back from the dead. And it required Scott to be available, so Marvel Editorial made the call. The moment Jean came back, Scott left his wife and baby in Alaska. This series was created without Claremont's knowledge. He fought Marvel's editor-in-chief over bringing Jean back at all. And years later, when a fan asked him why everyone loves Wolverine more than Cyclops, here's what the man who wrote Scott for 16 years actually said. "I thought Scott was a wonderful character until the moment he walked out on Madelyne and went back to Jean. And that was dishonorable and destroyed him as a character." Destroyed. His words, not mine. Now, if you watch X-Men 97, you actually already know a version of this story. The clone revealed, the baby, Mr. Sinister pulling the strings, Scott sending Nathan to the future to save his life. But notice what the show did with it. They had Scott give his son up to save him, and they let him grieve it. There's a whole monologue about what giving Nathan up cost him. The show framed it as the most painful sacrifice of his life. The comics version is messier. Scott does carry guilt afterward. The early issues return to it again and again. But guilt after the fact isn't the same as a choice that makes sense in the moment. And the moment is what readers never forgave. The show gave the decision a reason worth grieving. The comics gave him grief over a decision that had no good reason, because the real reason lived in an editorial meeting, not in Scott. And that's what I need you to hold on to. The single moment that made fans decide Scott Summers was irredeemable was a business decision wearing a character's face. He just had to carry it for the rest of his fictional life. Through most of the 1990s, Scott stayed in that responsible center role, important to the team, not especially interesting on the page. Then in 2001, a writer named Grant Morrison took over the X-Men and tried something different. They wrote Scott as someone who was tired, actually tired, not dramatically tired, just worn down by carrying everything. They gave him a messy emotional affair with Emma Frost, the X-Men's resident former villain, something that didn't make Scott look good and wasn't designed to, and that friction made him feel like a person in a way the clean heroism never quite had. Then Joss Whedon, yes, that Joss Whedon, went deeper a few years later. In his run on Astonishing X-Men, Emma does a psychological dive into Scott's mind and finds something devastating. His inability to control his powers might not be purely physical. Somewhere under the brain damage, there might be a choice. A child who decided the safest thing he could do was never fully open his eyes. I'll note the brand new 2026 solo series that's going on right now has since walked that back and made the brain damage definitive again. So both readings exist, but either way you look at it, the tragedy is still the same. And then came the event that changed everything. The Scarlet Witch, Wanda if you're nasty, the one you know from the movies, had a breakdown and rewrote reality. No more mutants. When the world came back, fewer than 200 mutants remained alive on Earth, an entire species nearly erased in an afternoon. Scott looked at that and stopped waiting for the world's permission. He built Utopia, a sovereign mutant nation on an island off San Francisco. The first time the X-Men ever tried to have somewhere that was actually theirs rather than asking to belong somewhere that didn't want them. He made the calls nobody else wanted to make. And when the world demanded mutants explain themselves, he stood in front of the most powerful people on the planet and said, "My family has spent our lives being hunted and hated. The world has told me I was less when I knew I was more. Did you honestly think we were going to sit around forever and just take it?" That's the character. That's who Scott Summers actually is when someone's writing him right. And it's exactly where Marvel decided to break him. Avengers versus X-Men. So, the way people remember it is not quite the way it went. The Phoenix Force, a cosmic entity of almost incomprehensible power, the same one from the Dark Phoenix story you might know from the movies, was headed toward Earth. Scott believed it was coming for a young mutant named Hope, who'd been built up as kind of a mutant messiah. He believed the Phoenix would reignite the mutant population, undo what the Scarlet Witch had done. The Avengers wanted to stop the Phoenix entirely, and they showed up at Scott's island to take Hope by force. Scott said no. Up to that point, this is a reasonable disagreement. Both sides think they're protecting something. That's fine. Then Iron Man built a weapon designed to destroy the Phoenix before it reached Earth, and he fired it. The weapon didn't work. Instead of stopping the Phoenix, it shattered it into 5 pieces, and those 5 pieces bonded to the 5 nearest mutants, Scott among them. Tony Stark created the Phoenix 5. That's not an interpretation. That's what the comic shows on the page. Now, Scott and the Phoenix 5, This is what they did with that power. In the next 10 days is a confirmed specific detail. They ended world hunger, solved the global water crisis, provided free energy to every nation on Earth, and outlawed war. One of the Avengers' own, Beast at the time, a founding X-Man, resigned in disgust because the Avengers were still planning to take the Phoenix Five down while all of this was happening. They kept going anyway. As each Phoenix Five member fell in battle, their piece of the Phoenix flowed into whoever was left. The power concentrated. The remaining hosts destabilized. And I want to be clear about what this is. That's not a character flaw, that's physics. The Phoenix was never supposed to be split 5 ways among human hosts. Tony Stark split it 5 ways among human hosts. Eventually, all of it was in Scott, and Scott, holding a force no human nervous system was built to contain, watching everything he'd spent years building come apart around him, killed Charles Xavier, the man who found him in that orphanage, the closest thing he ever had to a father. This is the detail that tells you everything about this, how this character gets treated. Killing Xavier wasn't even the plan. Marvel's own editor-in-chief admitted after the fact that the writer didn't set out to kill Xavier. Partway through the story, they just decided it had to be the last stand of Charles Xavier. So the single most damning thing Scott Summers has ever done, the act that defines him as a villain in the eyes of half the fandom, was a mid-story editorial decision. They needed a death. Scott was holding the gun they'd handed him. I think that was a terrible creative choice, and not because the story didn't technically build to it. They constructed the chain carefully. It's that the moment deserved to be treated as what it actually was. A soldier who spent his entire life protecting the man who made him, destroying him in the moment he couldn't hold himself together. That is a tragedy. Instead, Marvel used it as a verdict. Scott went to prison. The Avengers, whose weapon started the chain, walked away clean. That's the part I can't get past. Not that it happened, that nobody making it seemed to think Scott deserved better than to be the only one blamed. After all of that, Scott kept fighting, branded a revolutionary, still making the right calls, still framed as the extremist. And I want to be fair here because this is where his own teammates turned on him, not just editorial. Before AVX, Scott and Wolverine had already split the X-Men in half. Scott was running a covert kill squad and gave his tacit blessing for a teenage girl to take lives in a fight she might not have survived otherwise. Wolverine thought he was pushing kids too far. And honestly, that's a fair criticism. They had real reasons to come to blows. But here's what matters for the record. But even at his most militant, even running Black Ops, Cyclops never crossed into villainy or terrorism. Marvel's own writers say so outright. He got harder. He never got evil. Then in 2016, Marvel killed him. Not in a major event built around his history, his death was revealed retroactively. He'd already died from exposure to a cloud that was poisonous to mutants before the story even begins. His actual final moments happen off-panel, and the timing tells you everything about why. This was the era when Marvel was pushing a different super team, the Inhumans, as replacements for the X-Men. The movie rights situation made mutants inconvenient to the company, so the X-Men's leader became expendable. 60 years of history spent as fuel for a corporate priority. The fandom's response wasn't really grief, it was anger, because it felt exactly like what it was. Killing him is what finally turned the tide. People who'd spent years saying they hated Scott suddenly realized how much of the X-Men only worked because he was holding it up. His absence made the case his presence never could. Even readers who'd written him off started saying it out loud. This team doesn't make sense without this guy. When Marvel brought him back, they did one more quietly frustrating thing. They ended his relationship with Emma Frost, the one that made him feel like an adult with an actual interior life, and defaulted him back to Jean like the previous 15 years hadn't happened. It's the 1986 move in miniature. Erase the growth, restore the old status quo. It keeps happening to him. Then, for a while, he got something close to what he deserved. In 2019, the X-Men built Krakoa, a living island that became an actual sovereign mutant nation recognized by governments, with Scott at the center of it, giving speeches, holding the line, finally being the version of himself every great run had been pointing toward. And then a human extremist organization tore it all down, massacring mutants at a public event in front of the world. And in the aftermath, Scott ended up on trial, facing the death penalty. Punished again, carrying consequences again. And then Marvel launched a solo Cyclops series in 2026. Because they always need him, they always have. Like I said, I've been deep in the Ben Reilly story for this channel, and I keep seeing the same move. A publisher takes a character that people actually love, hands them a decision that they didn't make, watches the fan base turn on them, and calls it a natural consequence of who they always were. Ben Reilly, Scott Summers, these are the poster boys for that specific kind of character assassination. And the more time I spend with both of them, the more I think the hatred people carry for Scott is actually proof the character worked. You don't get that angry about someone who didn't matter. I started this video thinking Cyclops was cool and underrated, and I'm ending it thinking he might be one of the best things Marvel ever created and one of the worst things they ever managed. And both of those being true at the same time is maybe the most honest thing you can say about him. Do you think Marvel mishandled this character, or am I being too easy on him? Make your case in the comments down below. I want to hear it. And the story doesn't end when Scott kills Xavier, because when Xavier died, something bigger died with him. The dream. The whole idea the X-Men were built on. Next video, I'm digging into what losing that dream actually did to the X-Men and whether they can even be called heroes anymore. That one came straight from a comment on my Ben Reilly video, so if you want to shape what I cover next, you know where to find me. My name is Vactor, this is This Comic Cooks, and I will see you in the next one.